Peace, family. This is your brother, Mr. Holipsism. I'm doing a little impromptu show. Not really taking any calls or anything, but just having some discussion amongst the inner circle of my BAIO membership. And there was something that was brought up, and I see that there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about what exactly is a Diaspora African. Now, in the traditional Pan Afrikan sense of the word, Diaspora African really doesn't include African Americans. It really means any African, continental African, who's an immigrant in another nation outside of Africa. If I'm getting that wrong, somebody tell me who's a traditional Pan-Africanist, but that's what I get the sense it means. When you talk about African Americans, we're not even considered African. So how can we be a part of the African diaspora? Usually we become a part of the African diaspora when it comes time for help politically with whatever a cause is that's happening on the African continent. So we use basically, we become African and we become all one people when it comes time to defend causes of somebody else on the continent. But when it comes time for self-determination and nationhood, and you're really dealing with a landless people here in America who are African, we're not considered African because we're not born on the continent, even though we are descendants of African slaves. And when the BAIO says Diaspora African, we're speaking about a specific group of people. And the people that we're talking about are descendants of African slaves, descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. We're talking about a landless people. And those are people in America and all over, scattered all over the globe as a result of that event. People who claim themselves and who know that they are descendants of African slaves. Now, that may not seem like a big deal. It may seem like, it's trivial, or it's not like, well, what are you saying? It doesn't sound like it's much of a difference. It's a really big difference, in fact, because in the so-called conscious community, the vague abstraction commonly known as the so-called conscious community, because we don't, well, I shouldn't say we, because that community doesn't require you to be African-centered. It's like a hodgepodge of various ideologies that has a black aesthetic, for lack of a better word. I won't say African aesthetic, but a black aesthetic. And it doesn't really require for you to identify with land, history, and culture by identifying yourself as African. Now, those who have listened to me before, and I haven't been on the air for a while, so maybe this bears repeating. The word Africa is used to describe the land that we're talking about in that particular region. I don't want to have stupid intellectual discussions about, well, Africa is a Greek word and Africa is a Roman, Africa is this, and that's not the original name. I really don't want to go through all that BS, because you can't go to JFK and say, I want to go to Al-Qibulan. They're going to look at you like you're freaking crazy. You know what I'm saying? These lands have a name, and they're named by the people who control them. So if you want to name Africa something more traditional or whatever, then control Africa, and then you can name it anything you want to. And that's all I'll say about that, because I feel like a broken record repeating that. But I know somebody. I'm just launching a preemptive strike because I know somebody's going to come up with that nonsense. So to get back to Diaspora African, when the BAIO says Diaspora African, we are being very specific. We're talking about descendants of the African transatlantic slave trade. Now, that could be Africans that were dropped off in America, Africans that were dropped off in the islands, Africans that got dropped off anywhere. during that trip, who have no land. Now, if you calling yourself Nigerian, more than likely you have a land. It's Nigeria. If you're calling yourself Kenyan, you have a land. It's called Kenya. You're calling yourself Ethiopian, your land is Ethiopia. So obviously we're not talking about continental Africans. They're not a part of the diaspora. You know, the diaspora is outside of Africa. But specifically for us, we're addressing those landless people, like people in America who've never had socio-economic and political control over the environment, and people anywhere else, in the UK, in Brazil, anywhere else, the islands. If you identify as a descendant of African slaves, then that's who we're talking about. Because you don't identify with the land that you're in. You just live there. We live in America, but we ain't American. You know what I'm saying? We live in you can live in London, in England, but you're not English. You know what I'm saying? We don't identify with the places that we are currently occupying because we had no choice in the matter. We're there. You know. And of course, you know, for those who say, well, that had nothing to do with me because I didn't come from Africa, I was born there. Well, that's like saying if your mother and your father meeting each other is irrelevant to your existence. You know, people have this philosophy that they just fell out the sky, totally divorced from the group that they come from. Newsflash, if you got a black mother and a black father, you come from black people. So you didn't just come out, the stork didn't deliver your ass. You come from us. You're from our culture. So don't try to divorce. You can try to divorce yourself, but the world will remind you at every moment who you are. You know what I'm saying? So that's what I wanted to clarify. I wanted to clarify this whole African diaspora thing because people get confused, and then when they start talking about diaspora, they start including people who don't consider African Americans or Africans anywhere else to be a part of the diaspora if they are immigrants that actually voluntarily went over to another country. That's not who we're talking about. We're talking about landless people, people who have never had land, people that were ripped from their culture, ripped from their traditions, you know, their religions, their spirituality, their ways of life, just ripped from that environment, placed in another environment to make money for Europeans. And that relationship has not changed since the time that it began. We are still over here making money for Europeans. We don't have our own land, we don't have our own infrastructure, and we damn sure don't have our own nation. And the only thing that we really need to do is declare it. Declare ourselves as African people and declare ourselves as people that want land, that want control, that can run their own business instead of living in our mother's and father's house, which is white folks. You know? So that's it. I mean, this wasn't long. It wasn't like I wasn't going to have a full-blown show where I'm taking callers and stuff. But I just wanted to get that out of the way because people throw that word around, African diaspora, African. And you got to understand, who are you talking about? When somebody says, well, we're talking about, or we're speaking for Africans across the diaspora, ask them to be specific. What are you talking about? Who are you talking about? Are you talking about descendants of the slave trade? Because that's what we consider African diaspora. You know, descendants of African slaves forced from their land and made to work like beasts of burden in someone else's land, and then never having to know what it is to have self-determination and to have a land, to have infrastructure, to have nationhood, to have a socio-economic and political control over their own environment, to know what it's like to be on this earth and be free. So That's my thoughts for tonight. That's all I have to say on the matter. And I guess I will holler at you good people later. Peace.
You are a cynical bastard, you know that?
To reclaim the American dream and reaffirm that fundamental truth that out of many we are one.
You hear that line? Line's for you. Don't make me laugh. We're one people. It's a myth created by Thomas Jefferson. Oh, now you never go with Jefferson, huh? My friend, Jefferson's an American saint because he wrote the words, all men are created equal. Words he clearly didn't believe since he allowed his own children to live in slavery. He was a rich wine snob who was sick of paying taxes to the Brits. So yeah, he wrote some lovely words and aroused the rabble, and they went out and died for those words, while he sat back and drank his wine and fucked his slave girl. This guy wants to tell me we're living in a community. Don't make me laugh. I'm living in America, and in America you're on your own. America's not a country. It's just a business. Now fucking pay me.